opportunities for the cross-fertilization of ideas. So universities and college towns are long home to creative people, both students and faculty, and their presence can help to draw others to a region. There are two critical points here. The first is that the individuals who shape the future will be those who have the experience of higher education and who have the talents to work effectively in the new economy. But equally important, with their resident faculties, the colleges and universities are helping to provide the critical mass needed for this innovative economic activity. So society gets a double benefit when they invest in higher education. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons that a community such as Ann Arbor is so economically vibrant today. It's not only the 41,000 students that we've attracted from all over the world, and you should think of each of those non-resident students as a 9-month tourist. It's not just that, it's also the fact that they attract others, that many of the alumni want to stay in an exciting place like Ann Arbor. And so college cities nationwide are becoming magnets for new economic growth and new kinds of companies. Shifting gears a little bit, I think I'll look a little bit at some of the other social benefits of higher education. Today's economy demands creativity and agility, and that creativity and agility is supported by an academic background that exposes you to a wide range of ideas and also conveys to you the importance of sharing those ideas with others. What we do in college is that we tell students it is very important to take care of students. And that is a way of saying to the next generation of parents, it is very important to pass these things on to your children. We know, for example, people educated in college are much more likely to read to their children and are much more likely to provide their children an intellectually rich period of childhood, which we know has those children better prepared when they start for school. And by the same token, these are the parents who are more likely to support cultural institutions and various forms of enrichment for their children. Well, college is also a way that we help prepare well-qualified parents for the next generation. So the 21st century economy is going to require knowledge in new fields, and the companies that are going to be successful, like Google, if we want a big name, or NextGen, which is a small biotech firm in Ann Arbor, are the ones that tend to be entrepreneurial. They look for new ways to do things, they hire employees who are imaginative, and they want employees who adapt easily to change. So they look for a workforce that's college educated with the skills I've mentioned in thinking critically and grappling with complexity. For the US and Michigan to be competitive in the international economy, they have to have that kind of a workforce. Michigan's growing biotech field bears this out. Firms in Southeast Michigan are adding employees who have expertise in fields such as bioinformatics, computer science, nanotechnology, and they seek employees who have worked in diverse multicultural teams and settings and who have the ability to work across cultural divisions. Several biotech firms have developed in the Ann Arbor area in part because they can find the educated workers they need, and they can tap into the intellectual resources of the university's research enterprise. There's a strong symbiotic relationship that develops as students and faculty and businesses come together. In the past month, 9 of the 15 small firms reporting new hires in Ann Arbor were either University of Michigan spinoffs or they were started by student entrepreneurs. That's a very direct link between the knowledge and the entrepreneurship. So the investment that a state makes in higher education pays dividends to the individual, but also pays dividends to the state and the country and the whole, as a whole. The question is, how are we going to pay for it? So we've seen a big shift nationally in the funding for public research universities. There's been a lot of discussion on what it costs a student to go to college, and college is expensive, but I think there's a clarification that's needed. Nationally, public research universities have used about 92% of the tuition increases for the past decade to offset the declines in revenue, predominantly the decreased rate of support that comes from the states. A generation ago, state support to public universities covered about 70% of the cost, and students paid 30%. Today, this is reversed, with students paying closer to 70% and states covering about 30%. The decreasing state support has led to an increased financial responsibility for students and for their families. The public research universities educate 85% of undergraduate students and 70% of graduate students enrolled in all research universities. They're the leading source of individuals with doctoral degrees in key fields, ranging from computer and information science to foreign languages, math, physical sciences. Public colleges and universities lead the nation in educating students from underrepresented groups. These institutions play a critical role in our society, and we need to find ways to support them appropriately so they can continue to do so. Leaders in government and education have proposed some new ideas for how public education might be financed to more effectively support the academic programs and the opportunities for access and social mobility that higher education offers. I'll outline a few of these ideas, not because I think they're the final answers, but because they are starting points for an important national discussion of the policies we need to develop. It's likely that any new national policy will draw on some of these ideas as well as others that are going to emerge in the debate. So, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger of California has proposed amending the state's constitution in California to require that higher education receive no less than 10% of state spending, while prisons receive no more than 7%. I think what's significant about Governor Schwarzenegger's proposal is that it launches a discussion about priorities, and not necessarily because I think those percentages are a really good idea, but because it does talk about priorities. One of the policy ideas that grows out of Governor Schwarzenegger's suggestion is that of a consistent level of state funding for higher education. The State Higher Education Executive Officer Association, which goes by the acronym SHEO, reports that national data show declining state investment in higher education between 2000 and 2005, followed by a modest increase from 2006 to 2008 relative to inflation and student demand, came to an abrupt end with the advent of the recession. It's been softened by the infusion of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds, but these are now ending, and any further increase in state funding is likely to come slowly. These cycles of increasing and decreasing investment are hard on states, and they're really hard on universities. We need to think together about how short-term budget decisions fit with the long-term need to invest in education. I know that here in Lansing and across the country, legislators are wrestling with this issue in the face of their own declining revenues. As federal stimulus funds get used up, the discussion is more urgent and it's more difficult. But it's one we must have, and we must broaden the conversation to include state and federal government, higher education institutions, businesses, families, and philanthropists. Federal support for research universities. A number of academic leaders, including Mark Udoff, who's the president of the University of California, have argued for federal support for the operating and infrastructure costs of research universities. There are a couple of interesting ideas here. The first is that the nation as a whole benefits from the research done at these universities, and so the nation should help to support it. A second and related idea is that the federal government offers support to students through the Pell Grants and through loan programs, offsetting the cost of education for families. I should add that the federal income tax credits for college tuition is another way in which the federal government subsidizes college education. There should perhaps be similar offsets for the cost of education and research that the universities are incurring. So let me give you an example of this. I used to work at the University of Chicago. When we would put in a proposal to the federal government for research, we would put in the direct costs of the research. That's how much you had to actually pay for the computer time and the resources, the research assistants and so on. And then we would put in a request for overhead. Overhead is the costs that are borne by the university. It's making sure there's a building for you to work in and there are electrical connections and so on and so forth. The overhead rate at that time in Chicago was 102% of the direct costs. The overhead rate at the University of Michigan is 55%. What's the difference? Research is not as good? No. In fact, the research is nationally competitive. It's done by the same peer review panels. Now, the reason is that the federal government assumes that the state of Michigan is building the buildings for the university. And that's the reason that you can have a lower audited overhead rate for state universities as opposed to private universities. That might have been true back in